Ali versus Frazier, Tyson versus Holyfield, Hulk Hogan versus Andre the Giant. None of it compares to what we're going to look at today. The Raspberry Pi Zero 2W versus the Orange Pi Zero 2W. Right here on Jeff's Pi in the Sky. Hello once again, Pi geeks and techno nerds all over the world. My name's Jeff, and I'm an IT professional who's been in the industry for over 30 years. I've been using Raspberry Pi since they first came out, and I wanted to share with you some of the projects that I've done along the way. If you like what you see on this channel, please hit that thumbs up button. Subscribe if you want to see more, and hit that notification bell so you can be told when I put a new video out. Let me know in the comments how you get on with Raspberry Pis, and if you've got any ideas for projects you'd like to see me do in the future, put those in there as well. It's no secret that the Raspberry Pi isn't the only single board computer out there these days. Sure, Raspberry Pi may be the most famous, but now there are many competitors on the market. And this exists in every level as well. From the smallest Raspberry Pi right up to the most powerful Raspberry Pi 5. There's a competitor SBC out there somewhere for it. Recently, I picked up one of these. It's an Orange Pi Zero 2W, which is a direct competitor to the Raspberry Pi Zero 2W. And today, I want to put that right up against the Raspberry Pi Zero 2W just to see how well they compare with each other. Some of the results are really quite shocking. And it may give us some insights as to what's going to be coming down the line when it comes to Raspberry Pi models in the future. Let's go and get started. I guess a logical place to start here is, what do you actually get when your product is delivered? So right here is a brand new Raspberry Pi Zero 2W. Aside from the padded envelope, this is the packaging. It basically just comes in a static bag. So if we open this up, there you can see our Raspberry Pi Zero. Nothing really to write home about, but just one important thing to note here is that I've bought the version that doesn't come with the header pins pre-soldered. So it is just the bare bones Raspberry Pi. The Orange Pi marketing team are clearly a little bit more on the ball. The device is packaged in this cardboard box, and if we open that up, you then get a static bag inside that contains the Orange Pi Zero 2W itself. Now, the most visible difference here is that there's an external Wi-Fi antenna, and this is actually quite a clever idea because it means that the Wi-Fi range can be a lot more substantial than the internal antenna used on the Raspberry Pi. The other thing to note here, power and the USB socket are USB Type-C sockets, not the micro USB that you find on the Raspberry Pi. So in this modern age where USB-C appears to be becoming the ubiquitous connectivity option, this is probably a smart move. Just bringing the box back for the Orange Pi a second. In there is also another little bag containing header pins for the GPIO port. This is a really nice addition and not something you get with the Raspberry Pi. If you want the header pins for that, you can either buy a version that already has the header pin soldered to the board, or you can buy the header pin separately to solder on yourself. So with the Orange Pi, it's actually really nice to see that they package the header pins with the device as default. If we take a look at the specs of the two machines, they're fairly similar, but there are some marked differences. Both are based on a quad-core 64-bit ARM Cortex-A53 processor. However, the Raspberry Pi Zero 2Ws is clocked at 1 GHz, whereas the Orange Pi is at 1.5 GHz. The Raspberry Pi Zero 2W also only has 512 MB of LPDDR2 RAM. With the Orange Pi, there are different models available, varying between 1 and 4 GB of LPDDR4 RAM. And that makes it extremely attractive for any use cases where you are using quite a lot of memory. For wireless connectivity, the Raspberry Pi Zero 2W has 2.4 GHz Wi-Fi support and Bluetooth 4.2. On the Orange Pi, it supports both 2.4 and 5 GHz Wi-Fi and Bluetooth 5.0. For the display output, the Raspberry Pi Zero 2W can definitely do 1080p 60 frames a second, no problem. Depending on what you read, it might be able to output 4K. I've personally not tried it, but it might work. I've seen some stuff online where people claim to have been able to get a much higher resolution out of it, but I imagine it would be stretching the hardware quite a lot. With the Orange Pi, it can definitely output 4K at 60 frames a second, though again, that would probably put quite a strain on the board. Both the Raspberry Pi Zero 2W and the Orange Pi Zero 2W have got USB connectivity at USB 2.0 speeds. The only difference here is the type of socket. The Raspberry Pi has a micro USB, whereas the Orange Pi has a USB-C socket. It's the same story for the power ports, where the Raspberry Pi again uses micro USB and the Orange Pi again uses USB-C. For internal storage, both machines feature a micro SD slot. Both also have a 24-pin connector. For the Raspberry Pi, this is explicitly called out as a CSI2 camera connector. However, on the Orange Pi, I didn't see anything in the specs saying exactly what this is for, so it may be entirely proprietary. Both devices feature 40-pin GPIO headers. Both devices feature a GPU that includes the ability to decode and encode H.264 video within hardware. For the Raspberry Pi, it explicitly states that it can do this up to 1080p 30 frames a second. However, on the Orange Pi, the specs for this weren't clear. On the Raspberry Pi, the GPU also supports OpenGL ES 1.1 and 2.0. On the Orange Pi, it supports OpenGL ES 1.0, 2.0 and 3.2, OpenCL 2.0 and Vulkan 1.1. So purely in terms of specs, the Orange Pi Zero 2W is a very clear winner. The next thing I want to take a look at is the basic performance of each of the two devices. And I'm going to use Geekbench for this. Now specifically, I'm going to use Geekbench 5 as opposed to Geekbench 6. I struggled to get Geekbench 6 to run at all on the Raspberry Pi Zero 2W, and I felt it was a bit unfair to then use Geekbench 6 on the Orange Pi and Geekbench 5 on the Raspberry Pi. But I still ran into some difficulties, as you'll see. But fundamentally, all I had to do here was go to geekbench.com, download Geekbench 5 for Linux/ARM, copy the package over to the two devices, extract all the files from the package, and then you can just run it. Now, when it came to running this on the Raspberry Pi Zero 2W, I ran into a lot of problems. I just found that with only 512 megabytes of memory on board, I just simply couldn't run the 64-bit version of Geekbench. Equally, when I tried to run the 32-bit version, it would get part of the way through the multi-core tests, and then it would just hang up, seemingly because it was swapping memory too much. So what I've had to go with here is a result for the Raspberry Pi Zero 2W that someone has already uploaded onto Geekbench. This isn't from my specific run, as you can see from the date that's listed there. And I should also note that this was run on the 32-bit version of the Bullseye operating system. But as you can see, the Pi Zero 2W eventually achieved a single core score of 75 and a multi-core score of 127. Now for the Orange Pi, I was actually able to successfully run this on my own device. And these are the results right here, with a single core score of 135 and a multi-core score of a very impressive 462. So when we compare these, you can see that the Orange Pi results are as near as anything double for the single core and almost 4 times for the multi-core. This is really surprising given that the CPU is only clocked 50% faster. But it does go to show that the Orange Pi Zero 2W is a surprisingly powerful beast. Now I want to move on to memory performance. And in order to test this, I wrote this code here. It's a very simple C application. It firstly defines a constant that will equate to the number of bytes in 100 megabytes. I then just create 2 pointers, one as a source buffer, the other as a destination. I then fill the source buffer with 100 megabytes of random data. I then start a clock and I copy all of that data that I've just created in the source to the destination. When that's complete, I take another clock reading. I then calculate the elapsed time just by finding out the difference between the end time and the start time. I then free up the memory I've reserved and exit out. So effectively, what this application is doing is timing how long it takes to copy 100 megabytes of data in memory. I've copied that source code onto my Raspberry Pi here, and I can compile it really easily just with this command. gcc -o test memcopy, which is going to be the name I want to give the output, test memcopy.c. Now if I look at the directory contents, you can see that my executable test memcopy file is now available. So all I have to do is run it. Now the vast majority of time it took in that execution was actually writing the original random data into memory in the first place. But you can see here the time it's taken to actually copy the data was 0.25 seconds. Now let's switch over to the Orange Pi and see how well that does. Here on the Orange Pi, I've copied over my source code and I've already built it. So there's my executable test memcopy file. Let's just run it and see how well it does. So in this case, it's been able to copy the 100 megabytes of data in 0.21 seconds. So whilst this may not be absolutely destroying the Raspberry Pi at all, it's still beating it. And this is just a reflection of the Raspberry Pi using LPDDR2 versus LPDDR4 memory on the Orange Pi. The next thing I want to take a look at is how fast each of the two devices can access their SD card. Now I need to point out here, both devices have got an identical Samsung Evo 32GB SD card installed. So the card itself won't make any difference here. Now equally, I'm going to be using the HD Palm tool to measure this. And this doesn't give perfect results, but it's indicative enough for these purposes. To install it, all we have to do is run sudo apt install HD Palm. And then you just need to confirm that you do want to install it. Now that's installed, you can run it simply with sudo HD Palm -t --direct and then the name of your SD card device. In my case, this is /dev/mmcblk0. If you don't know the name of your device, just run the command lsblk and you'll see the name of your device shown there. Just put /dev/ in front of it when you come to run HD Palm. Here on the Raspberry Pi, you can see it's been able to achieve just under 22 megabytes per second. Now let's run this on the Orange Pi and see what we get. And here we've actually had the first win for the Raspberry Pi. The SD card access here on the Orange Pi is actually slightly slower, at 21.27 megabytes per second. It's not a huge difference, but it's a win for the Raspberry Pi nonetheless. The next thing I want to test is USB performance. In order to test this out, I've got an NVMe SSD drive. I've put that in a USB enclosure and then connected it here to the Raspberry Pi. So you can see that showing up as the device SDA. Now on both the Raspberry Pi and on the Orange Pi, the USB ports are only USB 2.0. And so these have a theoretical maximum of 480 megabits per second of transfer. In reality, it is highly unlikely that we'll see that kind of performance. But by testing against an NVMe drive here, that against a USB 3 machine could easily do gigabits per second, this should give us a fairly good idea about the maximum data transfer rate we can get out of our small SBCs. So on the Raspberry Pi here, it's been able to achieve 34.56 megabytes per second. And that's roughly speaking 276 megabits per second. So against a theoretical maximum of 480, it's not great, but still, it's not awful. Now let's compare that to the Orange Pi. On the Orange Pi here, we've been able to achieve 33.49 megabytes a second. Again, this is slower than the Raspberry Pi was able to achieve, though only slightly. This is roughly 268 megabits a second. But it's starting to show that I/O on the Raspberry Pi is slightly more efficient. Here we can see the GPIO pinouts for both the Raspberry Pi at the top and the Orange Pi at the bottom. Now the location of kind of reserved pins like the 3.3 volt rails, 5 volt and ground pins are all exactly the same on each device. And that's really nice to see. However, there are some really significant differences. With the Raspberry Pi, only GPIO pins 14 and 15, which are here on the right hand side, as the 4th and 5th pins down, are available for UART. On the Orange Pi, there are actually several pairs of pins that can be used for UART. There's UART 0 here, UART 2 down here and its transmit up here, UART 3 about 2/3 of the way down the board, UART 4 just above halfway on the right hand side, and then on pin 4 on the left hand side, and UART 5 then just below that. So if you need something that can support multiple UART connections, the Orange Pi is actually a really compelling option. For I2C, there are two options on the Raspberry Pi, in GPIO 2 and 3 here on the left, and GPIO 0 and 1 about 2/3 of the way down. On the Orange Pi, there's also pins 2 and 3 on the left hand side, but there's also the options here marked TWI 0 and TWI 2. There's also SPI options on both devices. So here, it's hard to say where there's a really clear winner. If UART connectivity is something that you're really desperate for, the Orange Pi definitely gives you more options there, as it does for I2C. However, if all you're after is basic GPIO ports where you can either use that to drive devices or read from external devices, then both of these two SBCs offer effectively the same. But for sure, the Orange Pi does take the win here, purely because it's got more of these cases of specialised connectivity. The last thing I want to take a look at is how good the Wi-Fi connectivity is. This should be some kind of measure as to how good the Wi-Fi radio is. Now the Raspberry Pi Zero is at a slight disadvantage here, since it's using a built-in antenna. But running a basic scan in NMCLI here, you can see I'm getting a score of 77 as the signal for my home network. Comparing this on the Orange Pi, I can see that my home router is the top MAC address that's being found, and that's now got a signal strength of 100 compared to 77 on the Raspberry Pi. You can also see it's actually found more networks compared to the Raspberry Pi as well. Now don't get me wrong, neither device is particularly brilliant for Wi-Fi connectivity, but equally these are just tiny little single board computers, so we shouldn't be that hard on them. It's also not that surprising that the Orange Pi also gets a win here. If you think about it, it's got that external Wi-Fi antenna, and so it really does just make sense. So let's take a look at the results here, and let's face it, it's a pretty dominant win for the Orange Pi. But of course there is one thing that we haven't yet looked at, and that's the price of these two. Looking first at the Raspberry Pi, you can see you can pick that up in the UK for £14.40, and if you want the installed headers, it's £16.98. Now this is a remarkably good price for a fully featured 64-bit Linux computer. And that is the beautiful thing about these little SBCs. If you just want to learn about how to use Linux, or you want to try out some simple projects, including driving electronics, it's such an amazing option. The most amazing part though is when you go onto AliExpress and you realise that you can buy an Orange Pi Zero 2W with 1 GB of RAM, so that's twice the amount that you'd get on the Raspberry Pi, for £10.69. Now granted, that's with a sale on right now, but even if you look at the full price there of £21.38, it is quite amazing, especially when you consider just how significantly the Orange Pi Zero 2W can outperform the Raspberry Pi Zero 2W. So what can we conclude from this exercise? Well, firstly, that the Orange Pi Zero 2W is phenomenal value for money, and you can do an awful lot with it. But with the trade-off that certainly here in the UK, you have to have it shipped over from China, and so it just simply takes longer to get it. And it is slightly more expensive. But what I find exciting about this is when it makes me think about what the Raspberry Pi Zero 3W could look like. Now, to me, the most important thing that they're going to need to do with the Raspberry Pi Zero 3 is increase the memory on it. having 512 megabytes is just not enough. And they need to find a cost-effective solution to be able to compete with things like the Orange Pi. If they don't, there's just literally no point in buying one. You could just buy the Orange Pi equivalent for only slightly more money and have it perform way better. Now, I'm a firm believer in market economies, and I love the fact that there is competition out there in the SBC space. It would be really bad if Raspberry Pi were the only ones putting these things together. The more competition there is, the more they have to outdo each other and come up with competitive products. And I can only see that continuing, and the only people who are going to really win from that are us, the consumers. But that's it for this video. Once again, if you like what you see here, please hit that thumbs up button, subscribe if you want to see more, and hit that notification bell so you can be told when I put a new video out. Let me know in the comments what you think about these different SBC options. There are several out there right now. The Orange Pi is the only one I've tried so far. So if you've got some experience with other SBCs, let me know in the comments how you get on with them. And if you'd like to see me do other videos like this in the future, where I'm comparing different SBCs, let me know in the comments as well. Thanks so much for watching till the end. And until next time, bye for now.